Hey, it's Robert Clickybeard, the host of the Commercial Landscaper podcast. These podcasts challenge you to grow as a leader, to stretch yourself beyond your comfort zone, and to 10x your company. I really encourage you to enjoy the show, share it with teammates, fellow business owners, and subscribe. That helps us grow our community. Hi, this is Robert Clickybeard with the Commercial Landscaper podcast. Really excited today to be joined by Aaron Kroll. Aaron, nice, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Robert. It's great to be here.
So, Aaron, for our listeners, I'd love them to know a little bit more about your background.
Absolutely. My name is Aaron Kroll. I am a founder and owner of Sterling Point Advisors. We're based in Richmond, Virginia. I started Sterling Point back in 2018 with a focus on the lower middle market. So think of companies kind of probably even under $1 million up to roughly probably $100 million of revenue, and guiding those owners kind of in the next stage of their life. Our slogan is guiding our legacy forward. So usually that means either through a sale or a transition of ownership, and that can be through a partnership or a variety of other structures that we're now seeing work all across the country, and been very fortunate to have grown substantially over the last few years, and the last couple of years especially been very focused in the commercial landscape space, and really enjoy being able to kind of meet with owners, talk with them about what their long-term goals are, and helping figure that out.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron, for that background. So I did see you at one of the panel discussions around M&A at Elevate back in Phoenix in November. Packed room, a lot of interest in it. It's obviously in top of people's minds where we at the space. I'd love you just to hear, I suppose maybe start off with, why you gravitated towards the landscape industry. It sounds like you moved into that maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So here at Sterling Point, we spend a lot of time focusing on the private equity groups and the private markets and what they're kind of interested in. And we kind of track that through a variety of ways and ask buyers kind of what industries they're interested in, what industries they're focusing on, which ones they're getting into, which ones they're trying to grow. When we started our firm, we started really heavily focusing in the veterinary space, specifically veterinary clinics, and they went through something very similar. Private equity came into the market, started purchasing, more private equity came in, and then it was kind of off to the races. It went from probably 7 or 8 buyers back in 2017, 2018, up to probably 50 to 60 buyers at the height of it, all really kind of competing with themselves to try to purchase these clinics. And really when you do that, as you can imagine, it makes the market go crazy. It makes valuations go up. It gets a lot of owners getting a lot of inbound calls, which I'm sure, a lot of owners now are getting in the landscape space. So we track those industries to follow what areas are popping, and landscape probably about, I would say 12 to 24 months ago, really started getting kind of a lot of interest from not only private equity groups, but just even larger consolidators and the like. So really kind of focusing on what was, the good industry to be in, and whatever kind of the metrics that the private equity groups use to go after. And think obviously we can talk about that to some degree more, but really they're kind of focusing on a number of things like recurring revenue, good, strong growth, the necessity of having to use the services. Obviously home services and commercial services exploded after COVID. So really kind of that focus is what drove us into the industry. And we were able to kind of work with a number of a number of companies, I guess, the last couple of years, and that has kind of snowballed into where we are today.
I suppose what you saw in the the clinics space, and I'm sure there's some other industries out there. Are you seeing similar patterns on what happens with those clinics, or is it still too early to say?
I think, yeah, for sure. And I think it's kind of mimicking, I think you go back to the 90s, it was dental, obviously had a very similar thing. Dental clinics exploded, a lot of healthcare exploded for the early 2000s with the tech and everything like that. It's following very similar. And what kind of you look for is the number of entrants into the space, how fast some of the larger groups are growing, and how fast they're making acquisitions. We even go as granular as the amount of outreach that individual owners are getting. We always joke that if you ask probably a lot of landscape owners, they're just crushed with phone calls and emails and texts and postcards and letters and everything and gifts to their office. I mean, it just goes crazy. So we kind of focus on what that looks like and how that's going. So it's mimicking that very, very closely. The other thing that we've been fortunate with, which we could talk about here, is how new groups are trying to get into the space. So, obviously when you're kind of seeing a tipping point of groups are either pulling out or not being as active, that might show a sign of the industry. And that's kind of the opposite right now in the landscape industry. We see more and more groups are calling me every day saying, hey, we want to get into the space. We've been trying to buy a company for 2 or 3 years. We haven't been able to find one, and we really want to kind of get a group and then start making acquisitions. That's really a good sign that there's a lot of people out there that are looking at the space and are interested in kind of getting into it.
I think you mentioned just before we started recording here that you've seen some interesting activity within the last, 2 or 3 months?
Yeah. So really, I think from the beginning of 2026, we've seen kind of a huge, I guess, surge kind of in the industry, even more so than last year. And what I'm kind of talking about there is really kind of those new entrants in the space. I think there's a lot of groups that want to kind of get that platform investment and to kind of start their own platform in order to make kind of add-on acquisitions as they grow. So we're seeing a lot of those groups really kind of being very competitive and offer really compelling structures and kind of going even outside of some of the norms of what kind of the other groups may be looking for at this point, as far as the actual individual companies, whether it's, all commercial maintenance or construction or enhancements, et cetera. Just kind of get that. So we've seen a really big push at the beginning of this year of groups that are really trying to get into the space, being very competitive and making some very compelling offers to kind of be able to access, their platform investment.
Have you seen any of those new people coming into the space look at the size? Because I think typically it's 2-3 million EBITDA and above has been typically that sweet spot. Have you seen people dip below that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was kind of a great point to bring up. I think that's another thing we're seeing is that, as those groups become harder and harder to find because they either have sold or they've already been rolled up or whatever it may be, that the kind of entry level EBITDA has dropped substantially. So I think a lot of the groups realized, hey, it's difficult to buy kind of some of these very large, commercial landscape clients and obviously even just find them. So if we're able to find one that has a good background, a good growth strategy, we can kind of dip way below those numbers and add on and build that out. And that might be, what we call a concentric circle, or geographically, meaning, hey, we'll buy one in, the North Carolina, build a circle around it. Or it could just be that we're going to kind of target 4 or 5 states and kind of find several that are very like sized and then put those together to kind of create the platform. We're definitely seeing a ton of that right now and hearing from owners more and more every day that that's who they're getting approached by.
Okay. Makes sense. How about, I know you and I both know that you don't necessarily pay for the potential, but if there's less and less companies out there and maybe they see some gaps where perhaps they don't have a good growth strategy, they don't have a good sales team, they just see a lot of potential. Are you seeing willing to change their mind in that sense?
Yeah, that too. I think it's not only, is there growth potential in the company can, like you just said, is because I'm hearing from owners every day. I think a lot of owners will agree with me that, especially at the beginning of the year, there's so much upside, right? They're just getting ramped up. They're getting ready for things. Maybe they bought a lot of equipment at the end of last year, drive down taxable income. They brought on a new BD person that's ramping up. So I think what we've been showing and seeing a lot more is kind of really showing that upside, saying, hey, they brought on 2 BD people in November, so they're paying those salaries, but maybe the sales haven't come in quite yet, or they're starting to come in. So this year is going to be a lot bigger. So we've spent a lot of time kind of looking through those individual companies' financials, looking at what the potential is and kind of using that as the upside. And that is, as well as you can also look at the strategy of, hey, I'm, in whatever market it is across the US, and there's 6 others that are, within a couple hours of me that are similar size. So there's could also be an acquisition strategy of, hey, if not only am I growing, but if we were to bring on, 5 or 6 others, that the synergies and everything else that the combined unit will be much greater and really be off to the races. So I think we're seeing kind of both those strategies that we're kind of presenting as both, hey, you grow internally and you're going to keep growing and there's a lot of growth upside, but there's also an upside with bringing on acquisitions and being able to show that path forward.
Yeah, I want to double click. There's 2 things sparked questions for me was, first of all, the opportunity for growth. Have you seen anybody start to think about, well, not only do I want to sell landscaping, but while we have that client, whether it be residential, commercial, but let's sell pest control, let's sell other trade services, let's sell HVAC. Any thoughts around those types of growth strategies as well?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's another great point. So I think we're seeing a lot of, kind of vertical integration. I might call it, of kind of adding in those additional services. One that's getting really big right now is irrigation. I think a lot of irrigation is quite fragmented, meaning there's a lot of, smaller groups out there, a lot of small companies that are kind of scattered that make a lot of sense. Like you just said, you're already doing all these services. What can we add in? So we're seeing irrigation being a very popular one. Any kind of fertilization has been really popular. Obviously, the residential side has exploded, and that's been a whole market in itself, kind of all across the U.S. But the hydro seeding or the commercial fertilization, I think, is getting really popular, and finding ways to add that in. The tree is a great one to bring up. Tree services is, again, it's kind of own M&A market in itself, but there's also a lot of smaller tree companies that can be rolled into this. So kind of looking at those, different avenues. Pond management has been popular for a very long time. Any kind of pond, water sampling or pond, management companies have been very popular. So those are ones that we're starting to see of, hey, if I already have this company, I'm already servicing these exact types of clients. This makes so much sense to add this vertical, not only to keep growing that company out, but also to, internally grow out my current client base and see if we can cross sell. So I think that's a great strategy, and one that I think is really interesting to a lot of owners, because, as an owner and business owner myself, sometimes it's hard to take on that yourself and kind of take that big step. But if you have a group that can help you, or a partner that can help you do that and kind of have that path forward, I think it's really great for the future.
I think you touched on this, maybe I misheard you, but some companies, like 3 or 4 or 5 companies, figuring out how can we consolidate and create that bigger revenue number. Have you seen any sort of activity towards that as well? I mean, it seems complicated, but I'm sure there's a way.
Yeah, I think both on the micro and macro level. So on the macro level, going back to some of the other industries we've seen that have popped with private equity, I kind of see that's probably where we'll trend, which is the larger consolidated groups will start looking at some of the smaller platforms. It makes sense, right? I mean, if you think of it as even just yourself, if you were to go buy your competitor and you were to buy one of them, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to buy 4 or 5 of them, but if you can buy 15 at once, it makes a lot more sense. It's roughly about the same amount of work internally as how you underwrite a deal and how you kind of look at a deal, but you're kind of getting all that revenue and all those synergies kind of at once. So that's on the macro level. And then the micro level, I think that's where we're seeing, I've been following a lot of the landscape M&A coming through, and we've seen several where, hey, we're 4 or 5 companies that have been thinking about this, but maybe we could come together and not only create synergies between ourselves, but really be a pretty large platform kind of from the get-go. So I think we'll see a lot of that, I think, in the next year or two, which is kind of these groups coming together to kind of create a platform of themselves. And I think that's where it could get really exciting, because like you just said, when you cross-sell services or verticals, you could put together several different companies into one that would kind of vertically integrate across each other and really have a lot of services and offerings for a wide client base.
Well, especially if they're across different geographies. I think that's appealing. And I'm sure if you do some of that, it'd probably take a good year or 2 to just iron out all the kinks and all the different merging of cultures. And, there's a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think, obviously at the conference, I heard it a lot. You get a lot of different companies that are very pro snow or anti snow or don't understand how to handle snow. I'm in Virginia, so we're kind of on that snow line. We usually get a couple. We got a really big one this year that was, I'm sure everybody was dancing over, because it was a great time for all the commercial landscape guys. So I think some will focus on that. I think that line will start to blur some. Again, I think these groups that maybe have not dip their toe into the snow markets will kind of maybe just have to, just kind of where their geographies they're expanding into. So I think a lot of the different companies and owners out there that are thinking, oh, well, I have to sell to blank group because I'm heavy in snow or I'm not heavy in snow, I think that will start fading some. And I think people are just getting a lot more open to it. And that goes exactly with residential. I think my biggest takeaway from some of the calls I've had and the conferences I've attended is, residential for a long time was just, kind of second to the commercial side, but I see it becoming much more popular. We're seeing new platforms forming in the residential space. There's a new one out here on the East Coast that's getting very popular. And I know there's a couple other larger ones. So I feel like the residential side is one that people become more willing to start really looking heavily at, and whether that's keeping it within the platform or spinning it out to another one that they do on the residential side. I think there's going to be a lot of unique structuring around these deals going forward, where these companies can kind of look at a very broad spectrum of types of companies across the U.S.
Let's take a minute to thank our sponsors. Urcher is a life brand born from grit, founded by Zach Strausser. The mission is clear: to raise $1 million for the trades by supporting vocational training across North America. Urcher makes tough, smart gear built for landscaping and snow professionals who work hard outside every day in all conditions. Their apparel puts safety first, helps crews look sharp, and honors the pride in their craft. Every purchase has purpose, fueling training programs and building a resilient workforce. Urcher isn't just workwear, it's a culture of respect, resilience, and results. When you contact Urcher, mention Wilson 360 and Zach and his team will take well care of you. What would be your biggest advice for somebody who's been in the business for a while? They're thinking about selling within the next 1, 2, 3 years. I was at the Leaders Forum a while back, and the ITR talked about, this 2030 potentially depression almost coming in. What would be your advice for somebody just beginning to sort of, is on the radar, not quite sure when, not quite sure where to go or how to build that roadmap?
Yeah, and that's kind of a question we get a lot, as you can imagine, as an advisor, is when is the right time? And we use a really simple kind of thought process, and we use it almost as an X. And really that X is the timing of the market and the timing of you yourself and kind of your future. And a lot of industries that kind of cross section never aligns perfectly, because the owner's ready, but then the market's depressed, or the market's really high, or the owner's not ready. Right now, the market is extremely elevated. I mean, as you can kind of tell just from my activity and kind of the activity in the space, that the valuations are up, the structures are up, the buyers are up. So that timing of the market is perfect for an owner to think about. So I would kind of tell a lot of owners to really think of, hey, if you're got a 12 or 24 month timeline, you really probably want to think of, hey, when does that X align when I think I'm 100% ready? Meaning your time should probably accelerate to kind of match the timing of the market. I think second to that really is kind of the thought of what you're going to do post sale. And I think that's the most important part of what I do as a job, which is when you're selling a company or when you're partnering with a group to kind of continue working, you want to sell at a point of strength, right? You want to sell when you're at the top. You want to sell when you're showing that growth, when you're showing that excitement. It's very tough to sell and say, I'm going to leave in 60 days because I'm kind of done with everything, right? If you want to say, hey, I'm going to sell, but I'm going to stay on, I'm going to keep growing it, I'm going to be there with my team that I've been with all these years, I'm going to, be an advocate for whatever group or partner I'm with, I'm going to go out and try to tell other owners about it. That's a really good, strong strength selling point. So you got to think of your personal timeline. If it's, hey, I want to be out in whatever it is, 3, 5, 7 years, it might be that you need to sell in the next year or two to kind of get to that timeline. Meaning you have to go through the process, which takes, 6 months to a year, probably give or take some time. And then obviously you have to stay on afterwards for some period of time to kind of either transition out slowly or kind of work through whatever your employment agreement would be. And then also with that is, when you're getting into discussing corporate equity, which is when you're taking, private restricted stock of any company that purchases you, you may have some restrictions on having to stay on in order to realize that gain on that equity. So you want to kind of make sure that timeline aligns with yours. Because our biggest fear always as an advisor is someone's going to call us and say, now's the time, but I want to be out in this short amount of time. And they've kind of missed that window. So they kind of really got to work backwards from where you're at to now. I think I'll take a second here to mention the partnership model and becoming part of a platform where you're kind of either retaining your percent equity or you're getting equity in a smaller platform. It can be really interesting because a lot of those give you a much longer timeline if that's something you want. So I think when I first started the company back in 2018, our average age of a seller was probably in their late 50s, early 60s, and that number's probably dropped into the 40s now. So I think a lot of our owners are kind of at that, maybe late, somewhat kind of past the halfway point in their career, but they're kind of thinking, okay, well, I probably got, whatever, 8 to 10 years left, and I want to kind of have an exit ramp on my own time so I can exit now, take some chips off the table, use that money to invest, kind of put that away and not touch it, use it to retire on, and then I can really kind of work it and try to get whatever percentage or equity I have left in the current company to really grow and kind of get that second bite of the apple. So I think that's where it gets really exciting. That excites us as advisors. I think that's a really fun place to be. And it's one that we've seen some really significant kind of growth and gains for our owners over the years.
Well, I went through a sale process myself, and I felt as though we did a decent job of due diligence on who the right partner was. I'm not sure if we made the right choice, but what would be your advice for somebody who is looking around and wants to find that partner? What sort of due diligence should they do?
Yeah, I think I almost need it probably as a plaque in our office that we say it so much, but our biggest kind of kind of number one thing is something called surety of closing, which means that you are actually going to close the deal that you think you're going to close. And that means not only at whatever you sign as the LOI, the offer, that's going to close, but that the company that's looking at you can actually purchase you. So I think we have a huge fear, obviously, is it's a long process. Due diligence is grueling. It's a lot to go through. Legal documents are a lot to go through. The amount of stress it is just a lot. So you never want to do that twice. You want to make sure if you're going to go through that whole process, that it's going to close at what you thought of, and there's not going to be any kind of negotiations really after signing the contracts. You want to make sure the group that is looking at you is well funded, they have the ability to close, that they understand the industry, which I honestly at this point could probably write a book on. So I think one of the things as an advisor we're really big on is making sure that we're doing a lot of due diligence, like you said, on the actual buyers. Are they funded? Where's the money coming from? How are they going to close the deal? And then obviously that's and then the rest of it is, how are they going to be to work with? How are they going to be to work with after the sale? How are they going to be to integrate my company if they're going to integrate it in with some others? How are they going to be to be as an advisor or be as a partner and all of those things? So we do an enormous amount of due diligence. That's why I do these calls. I mean, I think people would die if they saw my inbox on a daily basis of the number of private equity groups that are asking for calls. And I make sure I take those calls. I mean, I take them all the time just to hear their story, hear about their funds, hear about their how they're doing things. I like to talk to their portfolio companies, meaning companies that they might not even own inside the landscape space. So, hey, maybe they own an HVAC platform, or they own a whatever manufacturing platform. I'd like to talk to some of those owners, say, hey, how was it working with these guys? How was it to close? How was it to, get through that whole process? And then how has it been partnering with them? So then I can offer that, that insight to owners that I'm working with, saying, hey, I talked to them. I feel very comfortable with their ability to close. And they have some great references that you really want to make sure that due diligence is key. Because I mean, as everybody probably knows, a lot of owners don't always go at the highest price. I would say most of our owners don't. Usually it's a number of other factors that really heavily weigh on that, whether that's deal structure, cash equity, or working with them post-close, culture, all the way down to changing names and things like that. So you really want to make sure you understand kind of all those key components that go into the deal. That kind of become part of the whole package.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And I've seen a lot of scenarios where, they've really tried to find out what's the seller's job going to be after close. And, I think a lot of people are maybe having that weight off their shoulders, maybe some chips off the table, maybe they're moving to some type of a business development role or customer care or customer retention person. And they almost get their excitement back, because all that weight's been taken off the shoulder and not necessarily having to deal with their employees anymore.
Yeah. And I think it's just, I think a lot of owners really enjoy that. I mean, that's one thing. Obviously, there's a ton of good and bad about private equity, but one really positive thing they do is they remove a lot of headaches of owning a business, right? They remove a lot of the things that owners like myself just don't like doing. I mean, they're going to take away payroll and accounting and benefits and all of those things that are really usually time consuming, allow you to get back to what you enjoy doing. And most owners, that work, especially in the landscape space, enjoy doing what you just said. They like dealing with clients. They like getting new contracts. They like dealing with, different things, not having to sit, at a desk and deal with all of that. I think I also wanted to add too, is a really important point here, what you said about what they're going to do post-close. We used the joke that signing an LOI, an offer, letter really used to be the 50-yard line. And now that is maybe moved back 30 or 40 yards to kind of you're really just getting started. So I think there's obviously the high level things are kind of ironed out in the LOI, but there is just an enormous amount to still be negotiated and understood post LOI. So I think I caution a lot of owners that if you haven't gone through the process and you don't have a good advisor that does this every day, there's so many things that can be inside legal documents that you don't realize for sometimes years later. I mean, that can be everything from how long can I work all the way down to how is my equity actually going to realize in value. I mean, we have some stories from back in the day in some other industries where people have, rolled equity and then they found out when they went to cash out that, oh, you can only cash out half of the equity now and you have to cash out the other half in 5 more years. So if you thought you were going to get it next year, it's not for 6 years from now. So I think really understanding that, knowing where to look in legal documents. I mean, the legal documents, as you're aware, are very complex and they're very long. So just kind of understanding where you can push and pull, and then kind of understanding in plain English what those mean for you is so important. I mean, obviously sales price is very important, but there's a lot of other aspects of the deal that you have to be very careful to fully understand.
No, 100% agree with you there. How about on the other end of the spectrum where, I think with some of these mergings, people are dealing with all that merging of culture. So a lot of these younger new companies are popping up, they're listening to shows like this or listening to YouTube, and they're quickly growing to 3, 4, 5 million. What would be your best advice to them to, I suppose, best position their company so that they have probably the most successful exit in wherever it is, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, I think to start at the high level, being on a good, platform is very important. I think Aspire obviously is kind of the elephant in the room. Having Aspire makes you much more desirable because most of the, consolidators and a lot of the larger groups use it. If not that, then some sort of similar program that kind of allows you to be able to track that. I think when you start getting into some issues is when you're doing it all yourself, you're doing it on spreadsheets, you have, documents everywhere that are hard to track. So having a really strong, solid back office makes you much more desirable. It makes the integration much easier. It makes your life much easier post-integration. So you kind of get up to that. So I think having that is one. 2, obviously, is clean financials. I mean, I think a lot of business owners, including myself, just the financials aren't always the cleanest. You're putting personal things through, you're charging this to the credit card, you're traveling, and maybe it's part business, part personal. So I think even if there are things being passed through, or you understand where those things are in your financials, so you can kind of understand them and understand how to pull those levers, I think is big. And then I think going back, third would be, again, realizing yourself and your limitations and where you may be physically constrained due to a size of your actual yard or your geographic market. I think understanding that when you go to think about exiting, you again want to sell on that point of strengths. You want to sell when you're growing. You want to sell when you have upside. You don't want to reach some kind of limit or dip down even for a year and then try to think about going to market. So I think kind of having that longer term vision of, okay, I can get to X revenue over this number of years. And then I'll be, having to think about a second location, which is a lot for me to consider. So that might be a time. So I think all of those will make you, extremely attractive out in the market.
Yeah. And even things like, we do a lot of EOS, scaling up coaching as well. So just having that framework, that 1-page plan, the structured meetings, the agendas, I think that helps a lot in building that leadership team. So, Aaron, we're getting close to the end of the podcast here, but anything else you feel is worthwhile sharing just to our listeners?
Yeah, I think just, reiterating that it's a very interesting time right now in the market. I think the industry obviously is just really transformed from probably what a lot of owners saw a couple years ago. I love the idea of kind of taking it all in. I think it's awesome that people kind of listen to podcasts and are trying to educate themselves. I think educating yourself as much as possible. There's, landscape M&A newsletters. There's a ton out there just online, reaching out to people like yourself, Robert, or myself, just to chat about the market. I think there's a ton of resources. I am always available just to chat about the market. Obviously, no cost and no contracts or anything like that. I just love doing it. I love talking about it. So I think the more you kind of educate yourself, the better. I constantly, like I said, take these phone calls just to educate myself on kind of what the market's doing, what are people looking at, like you said, ways to, expand into services and things like that. So I think that's a big key takeaway is really making sure you're on the forefront of that so you can make those changes. And then all the way down to just the conferences. I think I got to, do Elevate in November, and I thought I took away a ton from there, seeing everything from obviously some of the panels, just some of the really cool tech that's coming out in the space is really interesting. So the more you do that, I think the better, and you can really kind of add a huge advantage to yourself as an owner and your staff and your employees and your families by doing that.
Aaron, really appreciate your time today. I know you're a busy person. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, email, call, text. I'm always available. I love talking. I love talking about the market. So anytime you wanna chat about it or ask me a question, I'm always available.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll make sure that your contact information is in the podcast when it's released. But Aaron, really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, and we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you, Robert.
That's a wrap for today's episode of the Commercial Landscaper Podcast. I hope you're walking away with some great nuggets that you can immediately apply to your business, whether you're in leadership, operations, or you just want to show up every day with that Ironman mindset. Remember, growth doesn't happen by accident. It happens with intentional moves, bold conversations, and surround yourself with the right people. If you found value today, subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with others. And again, don't forget to check out wilson-360.com. We have digital courses from account management, operational excellence, leadership development, or some of the other coaching packages we offer. Anyway, a huge shout out to our sponsors. Thank you very much. And I'll leave with this. Have a pure, dead, brilliant day.